Airta.
The 1986 title decider was simply one of the best races of all time, maybe the most exciting ever run. This race had everything: spectacular overtaking maneuvers, incredible situational reversals, and misfortune for one that benefited others, and a race winner that grabbed the championship when he wasn't the favorite to win at the start of the race. There were many exciting title-deciding races in the history of Formula One, but the 1986 Australian Grand Prix was certainly amongst the very best. That is why it is a race to remember. 1986 was a memorable year for Formula One. It was the theater of an epic quest for the championship involving four drivers, four megastars who would become legendary faces of the sport: Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell, Nelson Piquet, and Ayrton Senna. The strongest car of the year was the Williams, motored by Honda, driven by double world champion Piquet and by a relative newcomer in the race winner group, Britain's Nigel Mansell. The Williams was the car that should have been able to lead one of its drivers to the World Championship, but it was not what transpired. When Piquet decided to leave Brabham in the summer of 1985 for the greener pasture of the Williams team, it was clear in his mind that he was going to be the number one driver. But that was not a concept enshrined in the Williams' team's psyche. Except for Alan Jones, Williams had always demonstrated a preference to let their driver settle things on the track, so long as the team was winning. At first, that didn't seem to be threatening to Piquet, but when Mansell began winning races at the end of the '85 season, things changed in the British driver's mind. He went from a blunderer to becoming a formidable challenger for the title. Mansell had gained enough confidence by now to challenge drivers at Piquet's level. Piquet won the first race of the 1986 season in Brazil, but at the second race held in Spain, it was Mansell who was charging Senna for the win. Mansell was not able to beat the Lotus driver, but the ending was decided in a photo finish, with the British driver having dominated his teammate throughout the entirety of the race. Plus, the 1985 world champion followed with wins in Imola and Monaco, but Mansell answered with victories in both Belgium and Canada. Senna won at Detroit, but Mansell replied with wins in France and the United Kingdom. There, on the Brands Hatch circuit, he had beaten Piquet on a spare car that was set for the Brazilian driver. Piquet firmly believed that, as in his mind he was the number one driver for the team, Williams should have let him win that one. He was also angry at some of the tactics that Mansell had used to block him. But above all, he was humiliated to be beaten in a spare car that was destined for him. After Mansell's win in Brands Hatch, there was no turning back in the Williams camp. From then on, Mansell and Piquet would fight amongst themselves as hard as possible on the track. They were unable to coexist, each wanting the same thing: the Drivers' Championship. But at this point, it was mid-season, and Piquet had only one victory, his Brazilian win compared to Mansell's 4 victories. In other words, Piquet was beaten inside his own team, and this was not something he had thought possible when he chose to drive for Williams a year earlier. To him, the reason was the absence of team founder and manager Frank Williams, who had to fight for his life for long months after a devastating accident near the Paul Ricard circuit in the south of France 2 weeks before the Brazilian Grand Prix. Piquet thought that if the boss would have been present during the Grand Prix weekend, things would have been better off for him. But Frank Williams would not come to the racetrack before the British Grand Prix weekend. Who knows if Piquet was right and if Williams had given him the number one status, but the Brazilian now knew that he had only himself to count on. Then Piquet went on to win in Germany and in the first Hungarian Grand Prix, when he overtook Senna in spectacular fashion. Finally, Piquet had woken up, and Mansell, well, he finished third in those 2 races. All along, it looked like both the driver and the constructor championships would be Williams's. But Prost won in Austria, where both Williams cars retired. And after a few bad races, the McLaren team seemed to have also awakened. Mansell was still the leader on the championship with 55 points, but Prost was now second with 53. Senna had 48 points and Piquet 47. Piquet went on to win in Italy in front of Mansell. But in Portugal, it was Prost who was between the two on the podium. By then, Mansell had 70 points, Piquet was second with 60, and Prost at 59. The Frenchman was still in the battle for the championship with 2 races to go. But was it supposed to be like that? Many believed, no, that Williams allowed him to stay close by refusing to dictate things between their drivers. Mansell and Piquet were sharing the points, and that allowed Prost to stay in the fight. Senna, with 51 points, was no longer in contention. The penultimate race of the season was in Mexico, where it was Gerhard Berger who won with Benetton by keeping the same set of tires for the entire race. Prost was second. It was a bad race for Williams, as Piquet finished fourth and Mansell finished only in fifth. The British driver could have won the World Championship with a better result, but was unable to complete the task. For many, it was only a postponement. Mansell's crowning would come in Australia. But others believed that anything was possible, and they were right. By the time everyone arrived in Adelaide for the deciding race, all eyes were on the three championship contenders. But most of the gazers were directed on Mansell, the driver no one had seen coming, who was a new man since his first win in Brands Hatch in '85. To many, 1986 was a Mansell season. He was the most regular driver and the one who won the most races. He already should have wrapped up the driver championship by this point. But he had not. However, he was still the favorite to win in Adelaide. This last race of the season should only be a confirmation of its driver's title, but it would not turn out that way. The picture was clear when the weekend of the last Grand Prix of the year began. Mansell led the championship with 70 points, and a third place in the race would suffice in guaranteeing him the title, even if Prost or Piquet finished first. Prost had 64 points and needed a win. Piquet, 63 points, also needing a victory. At the time, a win was worth 9 points, a second place finished 6 points, and third place at 4 points. For the Constructors' Championship, everything was settled. Williams had already won it. Mansell was the fastest in both qualifying sessions, and it was he who was on pole for the race. His teammate Piquet was second on the grid. Senna in third, Prost is fourth. Last year's winner, Keke Rosberg, then on Williams, now at McLaren, was only seventh on the grid. The Finnish driver had a disappointing season, and this was his last F1 Grand Prix. Before the race, he assures Prost that he would help him, if at all possible. At Williams, both Mansell and Piquet basically hated each other by this point, so they could not count on one another to be an ally on the track. A major topic inside the paddock the whole weekend was the durability of the Goodyear tires. Berger won the race before on Pirelli tires by going the distance without stopping once to change them. As a result, all the Goodyear teams put pressure on the American manufacturer to do the same. In response, Goodyear was adamant that it was impossible to go the distance with their tires, but it was only advice. It would remain up to the team to decide what to do in the end. All the championship contenders were on Goodyear, so all things considered, the teams were on equal footing. But one thing that seemed to worry Williams more than McLaren was fuel consumption. At Williams, they feared seeing a car ending its race in the final laps because it ran out of fuel. The team would monitor this very closely during the race. Before the warm-up lap, Mansell made sure to clean the road of dust found in front of him by giving a boost of acceleration, thinking that this would help him out at the start. The green light was given, and the deciding race of the season would begin. Mansell was the fastest to come out of his box. Senna's Lotus was right behind him, and he too was very fast. It was more difficult for the drivers at the right of the grid. Piquet and Prost had at best an okay start. Behind Senna, there was the Ligier of René Arnoux. The French driver had a very good qualifying session with a fifth-place position on the grid, but his start was very poor. Rosberg had to get around him as soon as he pushed his gas pedal. Mansell had a very good start, but not as good as Senna, who already pushed the British driver. The Brazilian tried passing before the first corner, but he had to contain himself. The order at this point in the race was Mansell, Senna, Piquet, Rosberg, and Prost. That would not stand up for long. Senna was very aggressive, and at turn 4 he passed Mansell, who decided it was not worth it to collide in the first lap. Rosberg tried to do the same with Piquet at the same corner, but he was on the outside and he had to wait. It was the first lap, and some drivers were fiercer than others. Piquet was amongst them, and so Mansell let him go too at the next corner. As soon as Piquet overtook his teammate to be second, Mansell now had Rosberg on his tail, and the Finnish driver decided to go in front. Mansell had said before the race that it would be easier for him to simplify things and chase the victory. But he drove contrary to that in the first lap. He decided not to risk everything so early on. It was a calm and respectable way to act considering the circumstances. The third-place finish would suffice for him. It was quite a crazy first lap. So he decided to let Rosberg go ahead too. We were not yet halfway through the first lap and there was already a whole lot of action, with much more drama set to unfold. By now the order is Senna, Piquet, Rosberg, Mansell, and Prost. Prost was now putting pressure on Mansell, but he was a more calm, reflective driver and was not as aggressive as the top three drivers were on the championship leader. Prost, too, was unwilling to risk everything at this early stage in the race. He knew that the waiting game could reward him in the end. As the leaders reached the longest straight of the circuit, named the Brabham Straight, Senna, Piquet, and Rosberg had already built a gap between them and the duo of Mansell and Prost, while the Frenchman is still trying to pass the British driver. On the straight, Piquet was going alongside his countryman in the Lotus. He was on the outside, but the straight was a long one, and Piquet benefited from his more powerful Honda engine to take the lead. The first lap was not even complete, and we already had 3 different leaders in this race. Now in front, Piquet was breaking away from Senna during the last portion of the lap. Senna now had to deal with Rosberg, who, it seemed, had decided to give it his all. After this action-packed first lap, Piquet was the leader. He had widened the gap to a second on Senna, with Rosberg a second and a half behind in third place. Mansell was 3.2 seconds back in fourth, while Prost is fifth at 3.7 seconds. In lap 2, Rosberg passed Senna at the Decathlon hairpin at the end of the Brabham Straight to take second place. Then he too pulled away from the Brazilian. In the next few laps, Rosberg would gain a little on Piquet, while the 2 leaders at this point had left the others far behind. Meanwhile, Mansell overtook Senna, who could not stand the rhythm on lap 4. After 5 laps, Piquet remained the leader, but Rosberg was following him closely, less than 1 second behind. Mansell was now 9.7 seconds back, with Senna and Prost on his tail. The pace imposed by Piquet and Rosberg was very intense. Rosberg still had a loaded fuel tank, but he was already besting his lap record from the previous year. That was when he won the race in a Williams, clocking in at a lap of 1 minute 22.8 seconds. It was almost a full second faster than his record lap a year earlier. It was on lap 7 when Rosberg made his move on Piquet and overtook him. The Finnish driver was now the new leader. In as little as 7 laps, Rosberg had come from the 7th position on the grid to first on the track. He was driving masterfully at the beginning of this race. In the same lap, Prost manages to get ahead of Senna. That left the race order with Rosberg out in front, followed by Piquet, Mansell, Prost, and Senna. Mansell was still the virtual champion. Now that he led, Rosberg was taking off. We could see that he's the fastest on the track. By the end of the 10th lap, he had a priority lead of 3.3 seconds on Piquet. Mansell and Prost are 10 seconds behind him. Senna was being distanced by now. On lap 11, Prost is going in front of Mansell. This move had a large impact on the championship as it freed the McLaren driver to pick up his pace. Prost's goal was now to catch and overtake the holder of second place, Piquet, with the hope that Rosberg would eventually give him the lead. It was a long way to go, but this was a completely realistic scenario. But for now, even if Mansell was fourth, he was the virtual champion. Piquet or Prost have to finish first to score more points than him. Now in third place, Prost decided that it was time to go for it. He pushed on the pedal with the goal of reaching Piquet. Very rapidly, Prost is getting away from Mansell. At that point, the McLarens were way faster than the Williams. Rosberg had distanced Piquet in impressive fashion, and Prost is doing the same with Mansell, quite easily too. On lap 15, Rosberg led with an 8.2 gap on Piquet. Prost is 11.8 seconds behind his teammate in third place, while Mansell was at 18.2 seconds behind in fourth. For the next 5 laps, Prost continues to close the gap with Piquet. He was helped in a way when the two were entangled with back markers. Usually Prost drives more carefully around them, but this time there was no tomorrow. He was just a bit more determined than Piquet when they overtook them. As soon as Piquet went around the back marker, Prost is getting himself right in the gearbox of the Williams car to make sure he did not lose any time. And it worked. By lap 20, Prost is glued to Piquet constantly. Both drivers were now 14 seconds behind Rosberg, who was alone in first place. Mansell was 5 seconds behind them in fourth position. However, by lap 22, Prost has lost a little ground on Piquet. Knowing the French driver, we could theorize, like Murray Walker and James Hunt do during the description of the race for the BBC, that he had decided to save the tires instead of making an all-out attack. He had already pushed hard to catch Piquet, and his tires could have suffered from the chase. Part of this theory is the possibility that Prost and McLaren had decided to run the entire race with the same set of tires. It was while evaluating this potential scenario that a staggering turn of events occurred on lap 23, when Piquet spins out. He simply arrived too fast at a corner, and he locked his brakes. Piquet managed to keep his engine running and got back into the race, but by then, Prost was driving in front of him, as was Mansell. It was a complete turnaround of situation for the Brazilian, because his mistake just helped both of his rivals overtake him. It was a major development for the race, and it had implications for the championship, because Prost was now in second place. Theoretically, he could rejoin Rosberg and pass him to take first place in order to have a shot at the championship. But Mansell was now running third, and if he stayed there, even a Prost victory won't be enough for the Frenchman to win a second championship in a row. For Piquet, it was a very bad mistake because he too needed to finish first to be champion. And now he would have to pass his rival teammate and the two McLarens to accomplish that feat. It was a really difficult task that he set out for himself with that error. After Piquet's mistake, the order was now Rosberg in first, followed by Prost, Mansell, and Piquet. Rosberg had a lead of close to 18 seconds on Prost, who has a 5-second gap on Mansell. Now, Prost saw an opening. He knew that he needed to distance himself from Mansell and catch Rosberg in the same manner. He proceeded to set a new lap record with a time of 1 minute 22.5 seconds. He then set another one on lap 26, driving that lap in 1 minute 22.2 seconds. Prost is charging. He knew that it was his chance to once again be world champion. On lap 27, Prost is 15.4 seconds behind Rosberg, and by lap 30, it is now 12.8 seconds. By then, Mansell was 7 seconds behind Prost, and Piquet is still fourth, 12 seconds behind the French driver. At the time, things were looking fine for the Frenchman, but on lap 32, it's Prost's turn to endure a setback. He suffered a slow puncture. That was caused by a slight contact he had with Berger in Benetton 3 laps earlier. His 32nd lap was way slower than the others, and he had no choice than to go into the pits to change tires. It was far from an ideal scenario for him because of the possibility that the Williams car would run the full race without having a change of tires, like a sword of Damocles over his head. But for Prost, the puncture turned into a blessing in disguise. The French driver had decided before the start of the race that it was preferable to change tires at some point during the competition. That was contrary to what most observers had assumed, thinking that he would potentially go all the way to the end on one set of tires, as the Williams were likely doing. For Prost, this puncture came to mask that decision and comforted the Williams team in his choice to avoid pitting. Prost would lose a considerable amount of time by going into the pits. In addition, Prost's pit stop was very long. The mechanics had trouble working because of the puncture, and Prost loses more valuable time there. It took the crew 17 seconds to finish their work, around 10 seconds more than it usually would take. After this, the Goodyear people carefully examined Prost's tires, and for them, the puncture did not seem significant. It could have been caused by anything, really, and the wear rate was not important enough to recommend to Rosberg, Mansell, or Piquet to stop down and change their tires. So, they continued on their racing journey. One driver who had a preference to stop, though, was Mansell. As mentioned at the outset of the race, Mansell had decided to play it safe on this day, being more at peace if he put fresh tires on during the race. But the Williams team seized the pace of both their drivers, plus the fact that Piquet likely would not stop, and they decided that it was not necessary for Mansell to make a pit stop. At that point, it had to be said that even if pit stops were a constant occurrence in the 1980s, as it had been in F1 since its inception, it was not as automatic a move to make as it is today. Sure, there were changing tires and even refueling in the 1980s, but for some, a pit stop had always carried a risk factor. For the teams, if a stop was not necessary, they were less inclined to make one. Today, it is much more a common thing than it was in 1986. Back in the race, the whole operation is really costly for Prost. He had lost 2 places and some very important seconds on the leaders. After the 35th lap, Rosberg had a lead of 25 seconds on Mansell, while Piquet in third was 32 seconds behind. Prost was now 49 seconds back of his teammate Rosberg. We can say that he had lost around 30 seconds because of this tire puncture. His chances for a second championship were much less realistic now than just 5 laps prior. In truth, if Mansell and Piquet did not stop or had a malfunction failure, Prost's chances were slim at best. With the possibility that he had to cede the lead to his teammate virtually non-existent by this point, it was now clearer that it would be Rosberg's race to lose. At this point, only a mechanical problem looked to remain as an obstacle between the Finnish driver and his victory. It must be pointed out that Rosberg drove magnificently well on this day. He had a 30-second lead and he was clearly a couple of levels above his opponents. And for the championship, Prost's misfortunes have made things go Mansell's way. At this point, even if he let his teammate Piquet overtake him, Mansell would be the champ. At mid-race, the order was Rosberg in first, then Mansell, Piquet, and Prost. Piquet, for his part, began to run faster. On lap 39, he realized the fastest lap before doing even better on lap 40, with a time of 1 minute, 21.9 seconds. Not long after that, he was close to his teammate with the intention of taking second place. For Mansell, there was no need here to take a risk. Even if he let Piquet pass, he would still be the virtual world champion, and he had a comfortable cushion. When Piquet showed his intention, Mansell rebuffed him, just to harm him in his pursuit of Rosberg. But on lap 44, Piquet had enough, and he took care of Mansell. The British driver understood that it was better for him at this point to play defensive, and he let him through. Then Piquet took off. But there was a long way to go for him to catch Rosberg, 30 seconds being a massive gap. Meanwhile, things are still difficult for Prost. He was 45 seconds behind Rosberg. How could he find a way to climb back into contention? If Mansell let him go, he still had to pass Piquet again in order to possibly get some assistance from Rosberg. But how far behind would he be, and how many laps might be left in the race if he were to succeed? Truth be told, things were not looking good for the prospects of Piquet or Prost. In that desperation time, there was only one answer: push and see where it would lead. That's what Piquet and Prost are doing. On lap 49, Piquet went on to set the fastest lap. On lap 50, Prost beat him. They were driving as fast as they could, that being their only hope to success. At this stage, Prost had a card in his pocket that his rival did not possess. You'll recall, he had fresh tires. On lap 51, Rosberg still easily led the race. He had a priority of 29 seconds on the holder of second place, Piquet. Mansell then followed in third, right behind his teammate, while Prost is still in fourth, 8 seconds behind the Englishman. Prost continued to be fast, adding another fastest lap. But by this juncture, it was becoming clearer to him that the Williams did not intend to stop. It looked more and more like they planned to drive the entire race on one set of tires, as Berger had done in Mexico. If that was the case and the tires were to hold up, Prost can kiss his chances goodbye. For now, the French driver continued to push, and as the laps went by, the more he was able to catch Mansell, who was right in front of him. He pushed hard, and it could pay off. Now, both cars found themselves relatively close to that of Piquet's. On lap 57, Rosberg was still first with a 26-second advantage on Piquet. The third-place holder was Mansell, who was at 28 seconds behind the race leader. Prost was in fourth, 1 second behind Mansell. All the other drivers were at least 1 lap down at this point. There are only 25 laps now remaining. At this stage of the race, Piquet and Prost were the ones that pushed on their pedals. It was apparent for Piquet, everyone clearly witnessed smoke coming off of his tires at the time of one of his braking maneuvers. He pushed hard. It's important for him to stay ahead of Mansell and Prost, who on lap 60 were running together on the track. Now Prost was putting a ton of pressure on the championship leader, as he had done with Piquet 30 laps prior. He benefited from the back markers as he made sure to stick with Mansell's car when the British driver passed them. At the end of lap 60, we noticed that Rosberg had lost a couple of seconds in front. Piquet was now cruising at 21.8 seconds back of the leader. Maybe the leader gradually placed himself in a position where he had the chance to help Prost if the possibility were to arise. For that, Prost needed to go in front of the two Williams cars. His first target was Mansell. As they rolled along the Brabham Straight on lap 61, we could see that Prost was close enough to try something on Mansell. But Prost, being Prost, he would be precise in his passing attempt. but it needed to be done quickly as the Frenchman was now right in Mansell's gearbox. Starting at this exact moment, the race and the championship would take turnaround after turnaround. In real time, the next 2 minutes of racing was going to be decisive in the final results of the season. In the straight, a totally unexpected development transpired. Rosberg, the firm leader in the race, parked his car on the side of the road, and he retired. He was such a convincing leader, untouchable since he took the first position, that the F1 universe almost forgot that he could be victim of a mechanical failure. But that's exactly what happened, and he had to leave with what was looking like the easiest win of his career on lap 62. At that moment, the driver thought that his engine had given up, but in truth, it was one of his rear tires that had failed him by shedding its thread and flapping against the car. Rosberg only realized what had happened when he came out of his McLaren. It was a terribly sad outcome for the driver who was on his way to finish first in his last race in Formula One. The win, really, should have been his. Now out of his car, Rosberg gave the thumbs up to Prost when the Frenchman's McLaren passed him on the track. Rosberg's retirement gave a whole new perspective on the race. Piquet was now the new leader, followed closely by Prost, who had found a way to overtake Mansell at the same time Rosberg retired. So with Rosberg out of the race, it seemed to settle things for the championship. All Mansell had to do was wait to see the checkered flag. The fourth place holder, Ferrari's Stefan Johansson, was no threat to him, being one lap behind. Mansell had all the space in the world to make sure that he reached the finish line in the top three and then become world champion. But in pit lane, things were not as peaceful as they should be for the Goodyear people. When they saw what happened to Rosberg on the TV screen, they instantly understood what was at stake. By now, they knew that they were right in their pre-race advice. All the cars running on Goodyear that had not yet changed their tires should do it as soon as possible. All of them could suffer a puncture. With the race being at this advanced stage, there was no time to lose. As Piquet and Mansell began their 64th lap, the Goodyear people communicated this request to the Williams team. Williams agreed. They would bring their drivers in at the end of the lap. Mansell was now in the straight, being somewhat distanced by Prost, overtaking the backmarker Philippe Alliot on Ligier. Everything seemed to be going well for Mansell. He was basically assured to be crowned the world champion if he simply reached the finish line. It was at this precise moment that one of his tires, the left rear one, exploded in spectacular fashion while he ran at more than 320 kilometers per hour or at over 200 miles per hour. The explosion and the contact between the bottom of the car and the track at full speed created an impressive light and sound show. There was a ton of sparks that came out of the car. It might have been spectacular, but it was very dangerous for the Williams driver. Now on three wheels, Mansell had to work harder than ever before to basically regain control of his machine. It only lasted a couple of seconds, but it sure looked longer than that in the cockpit, where the driver tried to handle an out-of-control car that was traveling at more than 300 kilometers per hour without hitting the wall. In a way, right there, Mansell was driving for his life. He could be badly injured or worse if his Williams banged the wall at full speed. He pushed on the brakes as hard as he could, but without a left rear tire, the car did not slow down fast enough. He then had to weave the car numerous times, 11 to be exact, hoping to slow down before it would come to a complete stop in the escape section after the corner. That was a close call. It could have been way worse than it turned out. Luckily, Mansell came out of his car uninjured, but he was now out of the race, and that again changed everything for him. 30 seconds prior, he was in a good position to collect the third place quietly, a position that he needed for the championship, but now he would score no points. And Piquet and Prost are very well placed to collect the victory that they need to overtake him in the championship ranking. In the background of the scenario, as Mansell was trying to slow his damaged car down, we witnessed Rosberg's abandoned McLaren. In less than 2 minutes in real time, tire degradation had forced Rosberg and Mansell to retire, the last one in a very dramatic fashion. It was now clear for all to see that Goodyear rubber could not make it through an entire race, and those who would not stop to change theirs must act now. Prost had already changed tires earlier on, so he was safe. As for Piquet, now leading and in a very comfortable position to be world champion with Mansell's retirement, he was still on the tires that he started at the beginning of the race. Even if he potentially loses the championship on the decision to pit, There was no deliberation. After seeing what happened to Mansell, there was no point in taking such a risk. On lap 65, Piquet entered the pit lane. Prost takes the lead. It was a hard blow for Piquet, but it was simply too dangerous for him to remain on the track. After the race, he would go on to say that Williams had taken the right decision. Goodyear were right to say what they did on the information they had. I knew I was losing the championship, but I didn't care. I was alive. The race now had a new leader, Prost. It was a scenario no one could possibly see coming. Only a couple minutes before, he was running in fourth spot, with his championship chances diminishing lap by lap. But now, he was in first place, and very well placed to be crowned world champion. For that, he had to remain in first place. There were now 16 laps to go. Piquet's stop took 8.38 seconds. The question remained, would his fresh tires give him the proper rhythm to catch Prost, and maybe overtake him? There was plenty of race time left. It was definitely a possibility. On lap 66, Prost was leading Piquet by 16.8 seconds. The thing that has to be monitored by both Prost and Piquet was their fuel consumption. Both had pushed quite hard during the race, and it could come back to bite them before the end. For Prost, it was important to send a message to Piquet, to tell him that it was useless to charge, that he was well in control of the race. On lap 69, he set the fastest lap with a time of 1 minute 20.979 seconds. But Piquet had no choice. He would not be happy to simply sit by and settle for a second-place finish in the race. It was irrelevant to him. So he pushed. Maybe if he could catch Prost before the end. He set his sights on the fastest lap right after Prost on lap 69 too, with a time of 1 minute 20.944 seconds. The gap between the two was now at 18.3 seconds. The last 10 laps would be the longest for Prost. He had a comfortable lead on Piquet, but he knew all too well that he could be short on fuel. His onboard computer showing that he was sitting on the negative side since mid-race. About that, Prost says, "Even when I came in for tires, the gauge read -5 liters. In an ordinary race, I would have backed off until it had come back onto the plus side again. Maybe I would have settled for a safe third place or something like that. But on a day like this, there was no way I could back off. I thought if I don't win the race, I don't win the championship. I kept pushing." Prost has made his reputation on taking care of his cars, but today he had been forced to push more than usual, more than he would have liked to. It was either that or concede the championship. He really had no choice. On lap 75, with 7 to go, Piquet was still 22.2 seconds behind. The little hope that the Brazilian had left to catch his rival were diminishing at a very rapid pace. On lap 77, he gained 2 seconds, but he was still 20 seconds behind Prost. At the end of lap 80, with only 2 laps to go, Prost was now worrying hard about his fuel consumption. He still had a 15.4-second gap on Piquet, but by that time, it would come to no surprise for the French driver if the car he was driving suddenly stopped cold on the track. But the McLaren continued on its path. Prost now began his last lap. It would either be a win for him or a retirement on running out of fuel. At this point, Prost was preparing himself for the catastrophe. He was kind of expecting the worst-case scenario. Evidently, he ran as slowly as possible while keeping the lead. The people in the stands had no idea of the situation the French driver was living through in his cockpit. All they saw was a driver on his way to repeating as world champion, and they applauded him loudly. But Prost was only looking at his fuel indicator. Yet by some miraculous means, the car continued. He was able to cross the different corners of the track, and somehow he was now on the last corner of the race with Piquet at a reasonable distance. Somehow, the engine kept on running. And then he crossed the finish line. He received the checkered flag and goes on to win his 25th race of his career, and in doing that, his second world championship. Still in his car, Prost can't believe it. He raised both arms in the air, an expression of pure elation. He immediately stopped his car and parked it along the track. He simply could not go any further with his almost empty tank. In the end, it turned out that it was his computer that was wrong, but the driver had no way of knowing that while he was at the wheel. Prost was just hoping for a miracle, and somehow his McLaren had enough gas in the tank. Prost would analyze. This race was just crazy, just as I expected, and for once, luck was on my side. It's only fair. This year, I've been flawless, and this title makes me even happier than the first one. In the McLaren garage, it was absolute euphoria. Once out of his car, Prost jumped in a sign of joy, again raising his arms and putting them behind his helmet, as if to say, "Incredible." And it was. This win followed a magnificent performance by Prost, who was constantly pushing while he was able to benefit from the circumstances that plagued other drivers in the race. What a brilliant win it was for the best driver of the mid-'80s. His championship victory marked the first time since Jack Brabham in 1959 and 1960 that a driver would win the World Championship 2 years in a row. For Rosberg, it was only logical to see Prost win the title even if he was driving a car that was inferior to the Williams Honda. For him, Prost was a couple of levels above every other driver at this time. Believe me, there's Prost and then there are the others. I not only think it, I know it. Alain is the best I've ever known by far. He's the most complete of them all. Fast and torturous circuits, dry or wet. He has no weak points. He shines in all exercises, in all situations, and he goes really fast. What's more, he's a great guy with a great sense of humor. Three-time world champion Jackie Stewart, now an analyst for everything that touched F1 and a legendary figure, added, "You don't often see a guy win a race with a mediocre car," he says to Autosport magazine journalist Nigel, and yet this guy became world champion just like that. For me, Alain is unquestionably the best. But it was close. On track, Piquet finished only 4 seconds behind Prost. The new champion was going as slow as possible in the last lap while Piquet was giving it an ultimate but unsuccessful shot. Piquet too was unable to complete the victory lap. He was also out of fuel. Everybody was at their limits in 1986, and the Australian Grand Prix demonstrated it all. That this exciting season ended with such a thrilling finale was only logical. After having analyzed the situation following the race, Goodyear stood by that their rubber was not to blame in Mansell's explosion, neither in Rosberg's failure. It was the carcass that had given up. The rubber that both drivers had was the same one that they finished with and won with during the many races of the season. They were the same tires that were on Prost's car. Goodyear admitted, to their credit, that the burst was the result of a manufacturing error. They also stated that after examination of Piquet's tires, that they could have lasted the race, but that they had no regrets about stopping him for safety reasons. The 1986 Australian Grand Prix was a race for the ages. Close to 40 years after it was held, this spectacular championship finale remains etched in the F1 universe's memory. Those who witnessed it live or lived it can never forget it. For this race, the author was helped by viewing footage of the race on the F1 TV app, the race report in the French magazine Sport Auto by Gérard Jaby Crombach, the book on championship deciding races written by Christopher Hilton entitled Grand Prix Showdown, the book on the Williams team history by Maurice Hamilton entitled Williams, the book entitled La Grande Encyclopédie de la F1, 3rd edition, Tome 2, by Pierre Menard, and the podcast Formula Once Upon a Time with guest Alain Prost. For executive producer Simon Bachand, I am Jeremy Zaffron for A Race to Remember, Australia, 1986.